We want to make sure that we're stepping forward in ways that are going to be helpful. We want to be able to talk about the lives of children, their families, and what it means to educate us, right? When we have such a large number of people around the world who are being dislocated from their homes, their lives, and their livelihoods, what can we do about that? How do we step forward in positive ways to both think about this, to include it in the programs and the initiatives that we're offering, through a network of organizations? So let's just go ahead and begin by talking about, we hear this word refugee so much. Who is a refugee? What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you, Diane, for starting this conversation. And Oula, really glad to be in conversation with you today about this. The UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, has very specific definitions, and these are legal definitions that you can find on their website. Really important for people to be familiar with those. But the water is very muddy and people get very confused in thinking about these different statuses. So just to shine a little light, a refugee is somebody who has fled their country, is no longer in their country, and they fled for fear of persecution. So there's conflict. It's not safe for them to be there and they cannot return. And a refugee is someone who has had their case heard by officials and has officially received that status, that label of refugee. So there, in contrast, there are people who are displaced. These are people who also have had to flee because of conflict, because of persecution. They're on the move. They may not yet have had an opportunity to have their case heard. They may not yet have that official refugee status. Likewise, someone may be an asylum seeker. This may be somebody who has fled also for fear of persecution or conflict, who has not had their case heard yet. So there's a lot of language there that's important to tease apart. And when we talk about refugees as educators, I think we're talking about all of these people. We're talking about everyone who is on the move, everyone who has been displaced, everyone who is living in an unsettled space. But there are these very specific legal definitions that it's good to be aware of.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Julie. I think there's so much to tease apart, as you said, in this. The definitions can be quite complicated, and understanding, right, how we're using this terminology is really important. Oula, any thoughts on sort of who is a refugee? What does that term mean?
Yeah, so I'm not a native speaker in English, but allow me to add a term, which is exiled, because there are people who don't have really the status of a refugee or asylum seeker, who left their country because of conflict, or they've been forced into exile. So they are not refugees, but they are not also migrants. They didn't choose to leave their countries. And I can say this is, for example, my own case. So I left my country because of the civil war in Syria, and I'm not a refugee. I'm not a displaced. I'm trying to cope on my own. So this is also a different category of many academics, for example, or students who left the countries in conflict or because of other reasons, and they are trying to create a different pathways in other countries, but yeah, they are not necessarily refugees. And it's not about the terms, it's about the people. This is really something very, very important to think about that.
Absolutely. So it's really interesting to think about all these many aspects, right, of what is happening to people when they are sort of forced into these situations. So let's talk a little bit about why this is happening. What's happening around the world that's creating this? Julie, do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, first, just to put it in perspective, as of mid-2021, so this is prior to recent events in Afghanistan or Ukraine, there were 84 million forcibly displaced people, according to UNHCR. And so this is just an astounding number. And why, as you asked, why is this? And there are so many factors. Obviously, conflict, as I just highlighted, two conflicts that have been in the news recently. Unrest, destabilization of governments, and I say that both from political and economic perspectives. I think also we are seeing more and more natural disasters that are tied to climate crises. And this is also displacing people, both immediately because there's a flood or there's a fire, but also in the aftermath, because then there's instability politically and economically in the aftermath of those events. So these are some of the factors, and all predictions point to further displacement and further migration as the norms. These are trends that are on the uptick, and these are perhaps the new normals, as we talk about COVID-19 as a new normal, right? Living with viruses being very much part of our reality, living in patterns of migration and mobility, and also displacement is very much part of life at this point in time.
Absolutely. So, and it's really worrying, right? Really, really concerning to think that displacement in such large numbers, millions of people, right, is something that could be part of the way we think about how we live on this earth, right? And how do we sort of deal with that? So, Oula,
and unfortunately, I mean, just sorry to jump in, but unfortunately, we're not prepared to live with that, because we still live in bounded nation states with defended borders. And we see the complexities in this very moment in Ukraine of people trying to cross those borders and find a new place. And we also see discrepancies in how people are welcomed or not welcomed across borders, right? And so as a people and as a globe, we are not prepared for this level of displacement in this political and economic moment in which we're living.
Sometimes it appears really surreal for me. So I remember from Syria, from Yemen, we were talking about hundreds of thousands who were leaving or moving. We talked about 1 million refugees arriving to Europe from Syria and the Middle East in general in 2015. And now only in less than 3 weeks, they are talking about 3 million Ukrainians who left Ukraine to Europe. So the scale is getting really crazy, and this is unprecedented, I think. It's, since the Second World War, the World War II, we didn't have this level of displacement. And
I think that, and I think that all of this kind of leads us to wonder, right? How do we, as a global community, start to build better systems? And I think it's especially troubling when we think about sort of children, and how it affects children, which children are just at the stage where they're starting to grow and develop and to learn, and it can be so awful for children. And Oula, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that, how these sort of circumstances of living as a refugee really kind of impacts the lives of children.
Yeah, it depends also on the experience they get from their displacement or exile. But I think in general, they will keep a lifelong trauma, and they will keep scars. And I would say the better we manage to offer them support, mainly through education and through support to their families, the better they will cope in life. But I think it is something that will stay with them for life. And as Judy said, we are talking about now almost 90 million people. It's a country by itself of displaced people, and we need to adapt ways to integrate them so that they don't live in a separate community or in a separate society, because this is what is happening for the moment. For the moment, even if they are welcome or hosted in other countries, they are most of the time separated, And this will continue to, let's say, to deepen their scars, because they will always feel different. And I think education for both the host community and for the refugees together, this is one of the key of helping them.
So an interesting point, actually, because it's not talked about as much. Like, we talk about education in the context of offering it to the people who are in these circumstances, but this issue of educating the host country, right, and people who are hosting within those communities is critically important. What about children? How do we educate sort of host communities about what this means for children?
Because children are welcomed into schools in various locations and in various ways. And that is one space where they can begin to feel a sense of belonging. I say they can because they also may not, right? And that's where educating the host community is so important. And I think starting with schools, I would say also starting in the healthcare sector, these sort of places of public goods are really important, because this is where the contact and integration and community building can happen. And so a lot of the work that I've done over my career, both personally and in terms of working with others, is to make sure that teachers know how to work with diverse learners from a variety of contexts, and that they really feel confident in that work, that they feel comfortable in that work, and that they take on that work with a critical perspective, both of themselves, their positionality within that work, and looking at the larger social, economic, and political factors that are influencing that work. And so I think when I think about the role of schools and teachers, I think that we really need to ensure that these spaces are the friendliest spaces. These spaces are the most welcoming. These spaces are the most resourced. And unfortunately, when we're talking about education, we know that's not the case in most parts of the world. But really ensuring that they are well resourced, so that there can be wraparound support, so that the school is not just about showing up, getting your books, getting your rote learning, and returning home, but rather the school is really a place where there are additional supportive resources for your mental health, for your physical health. If you're having trouble adjusting to housing situations, the school can really, and in some cases does, provide all of that support. And I think we could do more of that and do better if we really invested in this sector of our social spaces. And then also really investing in the professional learning of teachers, of counselors, of school leaders, of healthcare workers, school nurses, making sure that everyone is well aware and well versed in the communities they're serving, and has the capacity to do that. So that also means having translation and interpretation support, and having materials in other languages, things that take a lot of time and effort, but really make a huge difference. And Oula, I wonder, in your own experience and moving and your children entering school spaces, if you could share, when that has worked really well and when that hasn't worked well, and how host communities could do better in terms of school and education being a welcoming and belonging space.
Because we moved from Syria to Lebanon, and my children started school there, and we saw clearly that it is because of political and historical reasons that there is really kind of it's not even a gap, it's something that separates the Syrian community from the Lebanese community in Lebanon. And it was really visible even with the young kids. My daughter was only 5 years old, and there were kids telling her, "You don't play with us because you are Syrian." So this is something that is really it's embedded in the society. While I can admit that the school management was really very welcoming, and they supported us so that the kids integrate well and manage to follow the new curriculum and all that. But I think the more people are educated, the more open they become. This is something that I think it will apply everywhere. So the more we educate people, and educate them about tolerance, about diversity, about inclusion, the better we will serve also the refugees and the host community, to tell them they are not just taking your resources, they will contribute to the to your country, because they are living with you. But it's not always the case that the host communities would see this immediately, and mainly in countries where resources are very limited, like in Lebanon before and more now because of their economical crisis. And so it works when the countries maybe, or the educational systems are functioning well, I would say. And yeah, most of the refugees don't live in countries where it works well. So this is
Yes, unfortunately, and that's something we've really got to do something about. But we also, again, see how important the school is, right? The school can be a place where so many of these issues can be addressed, right? It's a place that touches the lives not only of children but of their families, and can be really that hub. So we are seeing now a crisis happening in Ukraine. We know that it's not the only crisis, right, that is happening currently, and we've watched many happen over the past just even 10 years, including, I mean, we've had Syria, Yemen, we've got Ethiopia, you know, there's just places popping up all over the world. What are some of the things that you think are sort of common threads that you're seeing in a crisis like Ukraine, right, where we have millions of people on the move in a very short period of time, and some of the other crises that have been occurring? What are some of the common threads there?
Yeah, let me come in here, because since I live in Europe, I'm closer to it, and I'm observing what is happening. I think that the first impression is that Ukrainians were, let's say, they are more welcome than other refugees coming to Europe. So this was something that, it's helpful. I would not say it's lucky, it's helpful. But I think that the scale, the numbers, is something that is beyond even the most robust governments and systems. Even, here they are struggling with registration. They are welcome. They can stay. Many families are opening their houses to them. But in order to be registered, it's taking time, and the administration is struggling with this. Another issue is that Ukrainian is not a common language, so they don't have many people speaking this language. And this was a question about how, and I think it's mainly for, let's say, adolescents, how to integrate them into school. And if they don't speak the language of the country and there's no one who is speaking their language, what I see is that most of them, they speak English. So it's clear that they, at the moment, people who are leaving the country are those who have the most resources. But with time, I think things will change, and we'll have people maybe coming from rural areas and not necessarily speaking other languages, or not able to adapt very quickly in other countries. And this will become a challenge, because with time, people will manage to have other languages. But now, to help them just adjust and find their basic needs, they need support with their own language.
Yeah, just building on that, Oula, it's the scale that really is overwhelming in this current crisis with Ukraine, right? And it's also, when we think about refugees and displaced people, it's also the duration. When I think about the many families I've worked with who've been resettled to the US, when I think about the work that I'm doing in other spaces, I think about this issue of scale and of duration and of systems. And we don't have systems that are prepared, because nobody expects these sorts of crises. Nobody wants to think about this or prepare for it. So they don't. And then when it happens, you may have resources for a short period of time, but they're quickly used up if you do. So if I think specifically about education, if I think specifically about here in the US, when we receive newcomers, refugees or migrants, our education system is built to be an English-only system. That's not to say that there aren't multilingual supports. It's not to say that there aren't bilingual programs in some spaces, but it's meant to be a monolingual English language program. And to move that is almost impossible. I won't say it is impossible, but it's very, very challenging. We're also a system that's based on specific standards and assessment of those standards at particular time points. And so as Oula pointed out, a young person, maybe 14, 15, 16, who's arriving, who may not speak the language of the country or the curriculum, how do we bring them into the school and really support their learning? Our systems are not designed to do that. And so a lot of this becomes an issue of the way we've designed our systems and the lack of flexibility and responsiveness within those systems. And that becomes more important as the scale grows, as we're seeing in Ukraine. It becomes more important as the duration lasts, as we see with protracted situations in the Middle East and in parts of Africa. And so these are two things that I think are really important. Another thing I wanted to highlight, when you think about challenges for refugees and displaced persons, I think about the human level, and I think about the absolutely heartbreaking images we're seeing on our TVs of families being separated in the Ukraine, specifically fathers who are staying behind and children and mothers who are leaving, also grandparents who are not mobile, also friends who have been killed and don't survive. And this happens in every crisis, in every conflict around the world. And the students I've worked with, the thing that is the hardest for them is to not be with their friends and their family, to be scattered, to be divided, to have lost people, literally to have lost people who have died, right? This is going back to what you were saying earlier, Oula, about the lifelong trauma. How do we support young people and their families to rebuild lives and rebuild relationships and rebuild friendships and rebuild community when they've been separated from that? I think that's a really important piece also to keep in mind.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. It's really creating, it's different in each situation, but it's really creating even demographic imbalance in the countries which are suffering. For example, in Ukraine, men are staying and women and children are leaving, and I hope not many will get killed, or I don't know. It's really so hard for me to think about it. But families are separated. In Syria, it was the other way around. It was young men who were leaving. In Eritrea and in Ethiopia, young men, and no, young in general, in fact, young people leave because of the military service. So it's really tearing apart societies and bringing disrooted people in other communities, let's say young men alone in new communities, or women, single mothers alone with their children in other communities. For me, education is something that would help them to build their lives, but the scars need to be supported with other support mechanisms, with the society, with the community. And
this issue of demographic imbalance is actually really important, right? That kind of family sort of disintegration, right? That happens. It's really concerning. Education, I do think, is so key, because we've got to have it there for the children, for their families, for anybody really who has been in this situation, because it can be a positive force. What would you say to educators who were working in a situation with refugees to help them to understand A, the importance of the work that they're doing, and B, just some practical sorts of ways that they can help?
We always ask educators to do things, but I think they also need our support. So
they do.
So the educators in countries with limited resources, with crises themselves, so we expect them to be welcoming to refugees and migrants, but they are struggling themselves with their own resources. So I can understand that it's double effort for them. So we need to be aware of this and kind of support them and support their well-being with the more pressure that they are getting with the newcomers, I would say. But I think we should offer them proper training to be more inclusive, more welcoming, learn about the culture of the others, because we are afraid from what we don't know about. But when we know the other one, I think he or she becomes less scary. So learning about the others is something that can help. And I'm thinking about the small initiatives where they organize social activities so that people get to know each other, and this works well, but not everywhere. Let's say we have this chance, and so educators they can be the catalyzer for such activities with the kids, with the parents of the kids. So the most important thing is really to communicate with the parents, and this is not even usual in most of the traditional educational system with the host community. So how to expect it with the newcomers. So this is something essential, I think. And if we think about older students or children, I think if educators help them to become autonomous, this is something this will be helpful for everyone and useful for the society where these people are living. And becoming autonomous, it's not only about academic knowledge, it's about how to understand the society, how to manage to be integrated and to find a job, a decent job, and feel really valued and respected. Like refugees in Europe, they are fed, they are supported, sustained, but not necessarily integrated. So it's completely different. It's not just about education in the school, it's about also integration. And I think this is something that educators can bring in if they have the capacity themselves to all the resources.
Well, I love the word catalyzer that you used. I think that's a really great way of thinking about the role of the teacher in so many different ways. I think that idea of being a catalyst is really important. And as you said, in some contexts, more is possible than in others. But I think if the teacher can see themselves in that role of sort of sparking possibility, right? Creating possibility, space for newcomers and for the host community, to go back to that discussion of really creating space for people to come together. Teachers really they are builders of community. They're builders of community in their classroom, but they're generally builders of their community at large. And any teacher listening to this will say, yes, exactly. That's what I do, right? So if they can really see themselves and embrace that role, and then think critically about what that means in relation to displacement and newcomers, I think that's really important. And alongside that, thinking about advocacy and what are the things that need to be advocated for, and what are the ways to advocate. And I'm so glad, Oula, that you mentioned parents and really making sure that parents are part of the conversation and part of that community, and that advocacy is happening with and for parents, not it's not the teacher as the lone wolf who's kind of running off and trying to make something happen, but really the teacher is doing that with her students and with the families and with community leaders. And so thinking about those advocacy efforts that can happen through schools and that do happen through schools, and really thinking about the teacher's role as the advocate, as the community catalyst, and also then as a catalyst for well-being, and pointing out that that means starting with their self and really attending to their own well-being so that they can be present as an advocate and as a catalyst for their students and families. And that is really challenging in many contexts. Most refugees are, most displaced people are living in host communities, as you pointed out, Oula, that are very under-resourced themselves. And so, what are the ways to best leverage the resources that exist and lift each other up and advocate together for change that needs to happen for that entire community, both the host country community and the newcomer communities that are there, right? Because often there's so much that needs to be happening across the board. So I'm just really holding on to that idea of the catalyst, of the advocate, and of the centrality of the teacher in our communities and what that teacher as part of a larger community can do.
Teachers are so central, right, to our lives in community. And they can do such tremendous things as community builders, as advocates. But we also have to find the ways to best support those teachers. So when we're really looking at this, right, holistically, there are probably several things that need to happen, right, in coordination to design that global, we were talking at the very beginning of this about sort of global systems, right, that can really work together to support people who are in circumstances of being a refugee, and then how central education is to that. And of course, central to education is the educator, is the teacher. So some more work to do in moving forward, but certainly a really